Hey everybody, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be talking about building trade empires in fantasy settings. And this is inspired by Lit RPG Reads and an article written by Paul Bello, fine fellow.
Yeah, Paul Bello always has great stuff.
He really does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to help us kind of level up our RPG game, no matter if we're a DM or a player who's really good at, kind of like those bartering moments that come up in these games. So speaking of bartering, this reminds me of this campaign I was in where things went a little sideways. We were playing as this group of adventurers tasked with escorting a merchant caravan through dangerous territory. And this merchant was like a smooth talker, always wheeling and dealing. Turns out he wasn't just selling goods. He was brokering alliances, gathering intel, and basically playing this high-stakes game of political chess using trade as his pawns.
Wow.
We thought we were just muscle for hire, but we got caught in the middle of a power struggle between rival guilds, all sparked by this merchant's under-the-table dealings. It was wild.
That is a perfect example of how trade in a fantasy world can be so much more than just buying and selling. It's about leverage, influence, and sometimes those unintended consequences that can ripple through an entire world. And that's what Paul Bello gets at in his article. He takes us beyond that simple transaction into the heart of how trade empires rise and fall. Starting with those organizations we see in so many fantasy settings, guilds.
Yeah, guilds. They're everywhere in fantasy, but they're often just sort of there. How do they actually form? It's not like they just pop up overnight with a guild hall and a charter.
Right. Definitely not.
Yeah.
It's more of a slow burn. Building from the ground up, imagine a handful of skilled artisans, let's say blacksmiths. They realize they can get better prices for their work if they band together.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. They start sharing resources, protecting each other's interests, maybe even setting standards for their craft. Over time, this loose association evolves into something more formal, attracting new members, apprentices, eventually enough wealth to establish a real presence in a city.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all seen those stories where those guilds become corrupt or power hungry.
Oh, absolutely. As a guild gains influence, it becomes a force to be reckoned with. They control access to resources, dictate prices, and they can even hold sway over local politics. And that kind of power attracts all sorts. Ambitious individuals, ruthless competitors, maybe even a few with less than noble intentions.
Yeah, the drama.
That's where the internal dynamics get really interesting. Think about the different factions vying for control, the backstabbing and power plays, the secrets and schemes. It's like a whole mini game within the larger RPG world.
Okay, now I'm hooked. So we have these guilds, they're gaining power, but how do they actually operate on a larger scale? We're talking trade routes, caravans, all that jazz, right? This is where things get really epic, I imagine.
You're getting it. Establishing those trade networks is like a grand adventure in itself. It's about more than just finding a path from point A to point B. It's about assessing risks, securing alliances, and navigating both the physical and political landscape.
So many factors.
Think about a guild trying to establish a new trade route through a treacherous mountain pass. They might have to deal with bandits, negotiate with mountain tribes, maybe even bribe a corrupt official. It's a high-stakes game, and the rewards can be substantial if they can pull it off.
That's intense. It's like a whole campaign within a campaign with its own challenges and rewards. But let's talk about those rewards for a second. We're talking marketplaces, those vibrant hubs of commerce where the real action happens. I love those scenes in fantasy novels and games, the sights, the sounds, the smells.
Marketplaces are like the beating heart of a fantasy economy. It's not just about the exchange of goods, but the flow of information, the forging of alliances, and the subtle dance of power between those who control the purse strings.
So many things happening.
Imagine a guild with a monopoly on a rare spice setting up shop in a bustling market. They can practically dictate the price. And those who need that spice, whether it's for alchemical potions or a royal feast, they have no choice but to pay.
Now that is some serious economic power. I can see how a guild could use that to influence events far beyond the marketplace itself. It's like they're playing a grand strategy game with real-world consequences.
Right.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because it's not just about buying low and selling high anymore. It's about understanding the intricate web of relationships, alliances, and rivalries that drive the entire system.
Exactly. It's about knowing who to trust, who to manipulate, and who to watch out for. Because in the world of trade, fortunes can be made and lost in the blink of an eye. And sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a sword, but a well-placed rumor or a strategically timed betrayal. Those whispers and backroom deals, they can be just as potent as any spell or weapon.
And speaking of potent, That reminds me, Paul Bellow touches on something that I think is especially relevant to our listeners here: magical integration in trade.
Oh, this is where the fantasy really kicks in, right? Forget caravans and haggling. We're talking enchanted goods teleportation, maybe even using divination to predict market trends. Tell me more about how magic can shake things up in the world of commerce. Well, imagine you're a guild master and you need to transport a shipment of delicate glassware across a continent. Instead of risking a long and perilous journey by land, you could use a teleportation circle.
Whoa!
Suddenly, your goods arrive in a matter of hours, cutting down on risk, travel time, and expenses. That's a huge advantage.
Talk about a game changer.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that kind of magic be super expensive? I mean, I could imagine only the wealthiest guilds could afford that kind of power.
You're right. Access to powerful magic would definitely create a disparity between the haves and the have-nots. But think about the smaller scale applications, too. Enchanting tools to speed up production, using preservation spells to keep food fresh longer, even employing magical communication to stay ahead of the competition.
Okay, I'm starting to see how magic could be woven into every aspect of trade, from production to distribution.
Yeah.
But what about the flip side? I mean, magic can be unpredictable. What happens when a spell goes wrong or a magical artifact malfunctions?
That's where the risks come in. A teleportation mishap could scatter your goods across the planes of existence. A faulty preservation spell could turn your wine shipment into vinegar. Magic adds an element of chaos and unpredictability, which honestly is what makes it so fun to play with in an RPG setting.
Right. It adds a whole new layer of strategy and risk management. You have to weigh the potential benefits of magic against the potential for disaster. But even with magic, there are still some fundamental things you need to consider, right? Like protecting your assets, securing trade routes. Those things don't just magically take care of themselves.
Absolutely not. In his article, Paul Bellow talks about the magical protection matrix, a system for thinking through how to safeguard a guild's valuables using magical means.
Let's hear it. Give me all the juicy details. Enchanted vaults, golem guards. Tell me what kind of magical security measures a savvy guildmaster would employ.
Well, the first line of defense might be warding spells placed on warehouses or guild halls. These spells could be designed to detect intruders, trigger alarms, or even unleash nasty magical effects on unwanted guests.
Like a magical booby trap.
I love it. Exactly. Then you might have enchanted locks and barriers, impossible to pick or break without the proper magical key or passphrase. And of course, no self-respecting guild would be without a few magical guardians, whether it's animated statues, golems, or even summoned creatures bound to protect the premises.
We're talking next-level security. But I can imagine that kind of protection wouldn't be cheap. It seems like security would be a huge expense for any guild, especially those dealing in valuable or magically charged goods.
You're spot on. And that's a key point that Paul Bellow highlights. A guild has to weigh the cost of security against the potential losses. Investing in magical protection is like any other business decision. It requires careful planning and resource management.
Makes sense. But let's not forget about the human element. We've talked about magic and security. But what about the people involved? I mean, guilds are made up of individuals, each with their own motivations, ambitions, and maybe even a few skeletons in their closets.
You're thinking about those backroom dealings, the whispers in the shadows, the things that happen outside the official channels of trade? Exactly. Tell me more about these underground networks. What role do they play in the grand scheme of a fantasy economy?
Well, imagine a guild that wants to acquire something rare and valuable, but it's banned in their city, or perhaps controlled by a rival guild. They might turn to an underground network of smugglers, spies, and information brokers to get what they need.
Sounds like a job for a party of adventurers, if you ask me. I can already picture my players getting caught up in a smuggling operation, with hidden routes, secret passwords, and maybe even a double cross or two thrown in for good measure.
That's the beauty of these underground networks. They add a layer of intrigue and danger, creating all sorts of interesting scenarios for players and dungeon masters to explore. But even in the shadows, there are rules and codes of conduct.
Really? I thought it was all about chaos and backstabbing down there.
Well, even criminals need a way to do business. That's where contracts come in. A way to ensure that agreements are honored even in the most clandestine of dealings.
Contracts in the underworld. I thought it was all about shady deals and blood oaths. Those certainly exist. But even a smuggler wants to ensure they get paid, and a buyer wants to be sure they're getting what they bargained for. Contracts, even if they're not legally binding in the traditional sense, provide a framework for trust and accountability.
Okay, that makes sense. But what kind of contracts are we talking about here? Are they written on scraps of parchment hidden in secret compartments?
They could be. Or they might be verbal agreements sealed with a handshake and a shared understanding of the consequences of breaking the deal.
I can imagine reputation would be everything in that kind of world. Break a contract and you might find yourself blacklisted or worse.
Exactly. In the underworld, your word is your bond, and betraying that trust can have serious consequences. But even with contracts, things can go wrong, and that's when disputes arise.
Ooh, disputes. This is where things get really juicy. How do guilds handle disagreements, especially when those disagreements involve illegal activities or shadowy dealings?
Well, that's where things can get complicated. Sometimes they might try to settle things amicably, through negotiation or mediation. But if the stakes are high enough, things can escalate quickly.
So we're talking about guild wars, assassinations, maybe even all-out economic sabotage.
It could get that messy, and that's why it's so fascinating to explore these dynamics in an RPG setting, because it's not just about who has the strongest fighters or the most powerful magic. It's about who can outmaneuver their opponents, leverage their resources, and play the long game.
I'm loving this. We've gone from haggling in marketplaces to clandestine deals in smoky backrooms, all while navigating magical risks and shadowy networks. This is way more exciting than I ever imagined.
And we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to explore when it comes to trade and fantasy settings. But before we dive into the next layer, I want to hear what our listeners think. Imagine you're a guildmaster facing a major dispute with a rival organization. How would you handle the situation? Would you seek a peaceful resolution or resort to more aggressive tactics? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
So many possibilities for conflict. I wonder what our listeners are going to come up with. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that Paul Bello mentioned that I think is really crucial for any aspiring trade emperor resource management.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of caravans and marketplaces, but at the end of the day, a successful trade empire is built on a solid foundation of resources. We're not just talking about gold and silver, but the raw materials, the finished goods, the skilled labor, even the knowledge and information that drive a thriving economy.
It's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. But in this case, we're talking about knowing where to find those eggs, how to transport them safely, and making sure you have enough to keep the omelet business booming.
I like that analogy. And it highlights the complexity of resource management. A guild master has to think about sourcing materials, negotiating prices, securing storage, managing inventory. It's a whole logistical puzzle, and one misstep can throw everything off balance.
I could see how that could get overwhelming. It's not just about buying low and selling high anymore. It's about understanding that entire chain of supply and demand, knowing what's valuable, what's scarce, and how to anticipate those market fluctuations.
You got it.
And then you have the added challenge of protecting your resources. We've talked about magical security measures, but what about theft, natural disasters, even the political instability? A savvy guild master has to be prepared for all sorts of unexpected events.
Right, it's like a constant game of chess. Trying to anticipate your opponent's next move while also safeguarding your own pieces.
Exactly. Speaking of opponents, what about those rival guilds we talked about earlier? Are they just competing for resources, or are there deeper conflicts at play?
Competition is definitely a factor, but there's often more to it than that. Guilds might have clashing ideologies, historical grudges, even personal vendettas between the leaders, and these conflicts can manifest in all sorts of ways, from economic sabotage to outright violence.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. I can imagine those conflicts spilling over into the streets, leading to all sorts of exciting scenarios for players to get involved in. A daring heist to steal a rival guild's secrets, a clandestine meeting to broker a truce, maybe even a full-blown guild war with magical duels and epic battles.
Exactly. And that's why trade in a fantasy setting is so much more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about power ambition and the clash of wills in a world where fortunes can be made and lost overnight.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I never realized how much depth and complexity there was to trade in a fantasy world. We've covered everything from guild structures and trade routes to magical security measures and underground networks.
And through it all, we've seen how trade is a driving force in these worlds, shaping economies, influencing politics, and even sparking those epic conflicts that can change the course of history.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even in a world of magic and monsters, the principles of economics and human nature, they still apply. And it's those human elements, the ambition, the greed, the thirst for power, that's what makes these stories so compelling. A huge thanks to Paul Bello Feinfellow for sparking this amazing conversation. And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you'd handle that guild rivalry. So be sure to leave a comment. Until next time, happy trading.